In Diablo 2, fear effects can be interesting, and they were made even more so by changes in 2.4, specifically to Grim Ward. So today we're going to look at all the sources of fear and how they fit into the AI override stack that we covered in the Necromancer curse videos. And these will all override other standard curses when used, which is one big reason why they're only used in very specific builds like pitzerkers and for unplugging narrow passageways for summoners. Now, much like dim vision, fear effects are fairly easy to override themselves, but unlike other curses, fear effects have a hierarchy for which one will always win against the lower ones rather than going for something like highest level or longer duration. So it is possible to override a long duration fear effect with the lower duration one if you just happen to get the wrong stack. Now, the way fear works is when it's applied to the enemy, it tells their AI to run away at the next AI check. So enemies may keep running towards you for a moment, but as soon as they trigger that AI check, they will begin running away from the player. It is worth noting that, as with other AI curses, enemy AI can be broken by these skills, resulting in them going into an idle mode rather than fleeing, though it is hard to reproduce reliably. All fear effects function this way, usually using a duration rule for how long something will try to run. Starting out with the lowest flee effect on the totem, we have Howl, that despite being able to be overridden by all the other fear effects is actually a rather unique skill in a few respects. First, it delivers the fear effect using projectiles, just like all Warcry applications function, so enemies can thread between the missiles and be unaffected by it, but generally speaking, if the radius is still within the normal screen space, you will not see this very often. The other odd aspect is that it is the only fear effect that has a level formula. Simply put, unlike Terror and Grim Ward, whenever you hit an enemy with Howl, the game checks the monster's level against your level plus the skill level plus 1. And if the monster level is higher, it will not be hit by fear. If it is lower, it will be. After Howl, we have the combat ability called Hit Causes Monster to Flee. This can override Howl's effect, and is sometimes one of the ways you end up with shorter duration fears after longer duration Howls. Now, as far as the mechanics of this, it basically triggers a % chance to apply the fear curse effect on them. And while the percents listed are not always super accurate, the margin of error on them is usually about 1% at most, so it's not going to make a big difference for the intended use. It is also an interesting note that if your attack triggers blind target and monster flee from equipment, the monster flee effect will override the blind effect, though when it comes to chance to cast effects, those are a little bit different due to trigger orders. Back to the skills though, we have Terror, the Necromancer curse, which overrides both of the previous fear effects but also has god-awful radius. And while most other skills update their tooltips to reflect their durations in Nightmare and Hell, Terror forgets to. So remember that Nightmare halves the duration and Hell quarters it, so you're going to get a lot less time with this than you might think in Hell, but at least it doesn't require a level check like Howl. And despite being just the same as the rest of the fear effects, having one level in this as Necro can be pretty useful for crowd manipulation while you're trying to navigate as a summoner, or to give you a little bit of breathing room if you're not in a location that's good for corralling with Bone Wall or Bone Prison as a Bone Mancer. So while I prefer Confuse in most situations, it can be a handy one-point wonder for specific situations. And lastly, we have Grim Ward, a fairly significant change skill in 2.4. It is an AoE terror effect, though the enemies will run from you, not the totem, so keep that in mind. And while the duration of the fear effect is short, it will continually reapply it as long as the enemy is in range of the totem. As far as how it works mechanically, it can only be summoned from what is known as a soft corpse, so one with a proper amount of flesh and bones. So it can be summoned from a zombie, but not a wraith or a skeleton or even a thorned hulk, for example, since they don't have enough flesh and bone, and it will summon a different cosmetic totem depending on the size of the opponent. Now, if this was an older version of the game, this is where it would stop, but instead, this skill got 2 buffs in 2.4. Namely, it now slows enemies affected by fear, as well as reducing their physical damage resistance. Now, it's important to note this effect is tied to the curse it causes, not just being near the totem. So as you can probably guess, it will not deliver these effects on anything except normal and minion monsters, which means you will not get the slow or the damage boost against uniques, champions, or even bosses that happen to have minions near them to summon it from. So that does limit its use, but it is a lot of fun to throw on a barbarian or as part of a group with something like a multi-shot Amazon. So do you use any of the fear effects for your builds, or do you avoid them so you don't have to track enemies down? Discuss it below, and as always, a special thanks to channel members, patrons, and Twitch subs that make this content possible.